the hire of an harlot. Now, it says in verse 8, Therefore I will wail and howl, I will go stripped and naked, I will make a wailing like the dragons, and mourning as the owls, for her wound is incurable. For it is come unto Judah, he is come unto the gate of my people, even Jerusalem. And so this is both, it begins really in verse 6, including Samaria, but God's condemnation to these people is, you've worshipped idols so much that you are like a harlot. You're unfaithful to me. You have no faithfulness with me. And you are going to be destroyed and exposed in such a way that there's going to be great wailing. And don't even come to me about it. Verse 10, Declare ye it not at Gath, weep ye not at all. Just don't be sorry about it. Don't be sad about it. In the house of Ephraim, roll thyself in the dust. Pass ye away, thou inhabitant of Saphir, having thy shame naked. The inhabitant of Zanon came not forth in the morning of Beth Ezel. He shall receive of you his standing. And goes on to just mention each of these places. In verse 16, Make thee bald, and poll thee for thy delicate children. Enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are gone into captivity from thee. And so what we see here is this, don't even mourn because you've gone your way and it's too late. And Christian, I want to say to you this evening that many times we are guilty of being without emotion until our consequences come. It's interesting, is it not, that we are okay with being away from the Lord in our relationship with Him until things go wrong. And God says through His man Micah, listen, don't cry when things go wrong. Don't cry when things go wrong because you know where it came from. Listen, don't go to the heathen and mention to them the terrible things that the Lord has done in judgment to you because you don't listen to the Lord. You don't have a relationship with the Lord. And why in the world would you expect God's blessing? Isn't it interesting how that we reject God and require His blessing as though we could? We'll reject God's plan, God's way, and when things go wrong, it's God's fault. Christian, don't go to God Almighty and say, God, things are messed up in my life. He knows why the things are messed up in your life. And let's just be honest about it. It started when you stopped being concerned about a right relationship with Him. Friend, I've never gotten into a bad place in the Lord's leading. God's never led me into the wrong place. Listen, I've never been walking closely in fellowship with the Almighty and found myself in a den of wickedness. I promise you, you study the Old Testament, you study King David, and you look at the time that he found himself in Ziklag, a city of the Philistines. David shouldn't have been there. David shouldn't have gone there. You study the Bible and you'll find that's the truth. Just because David did it didn't mean he should have. And the morning that, in the terrible times when Ziklag was burned and his people said, you know what, it's David's fault, we ought to kill him. And David is at this terrible time and he's on his face before the Lord and he realizes, you know what, I shouldn't have been there. And Christian, the thing that we ought to do when we find ourselves in the wrong place is not point fingers at God Almighty and say, look what God's done to me. The thing we ought to do is say, you know what, I shouldn't be here and it's not God's fault. And Micah is saying to the nation of Israel, if you want to cry and whine about your condition, you want to cry and whine about being in captivity, maybe instead you ought to figure out why you're in captivity. Maybe you shouldn't have made a league with the enemy and you wouldn't be destroyed by him. Maybe you shouldn't have worshipped his idol. And God's first charge against the Israel and Samaria, who is called Jacob because of its unfaithfulness. God's first charge against them is, hey, you have worshipped idols. And now you want to say it's my fault. Listen, my friend, the day that you're faithful to the Lord and He's unfaithful to you, you can point your finger and accuse Him. When do you think that day will come? Never. It'll never come. And that is Micah's charge against Israel and Samaria. Hey, the day that you are in a terrible place and you're far away from God, and it's His fault, then you can accuse. But until then, it won't do any good to cry. Well, we're real good at pity parties. Well, how many times do we cry when things go wrong and it's our fault? That's amazing. If parents, teach your children not to cry when they're wrong. You know what my parents used to say, and it helped me, honest truth. Really helped form my character. When I was a kid and I'd done wrong, my parents said, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Now I know that's one of those terrible trite statements that parents should never make, but it's an effective statement. It's true. Listen, if your kid's crying because he did wrong and now he's caught, teach him not to cry. If he's crying because he understands that he's broken God's law and he's done a terrible sin against God Almighty, well, he can cry about that, but don't tell him don't cry when he's going to be judged. Tell him to face up. Tell her to face up and just go ahead and just say, you know what, I deserve it. I'll tell you something. I've learned many times to just say, well, you know what, everything that comes to me I deserve. Goes around, comes around, and I certainly sent it off going around, and now it's come around and hit me right back in the head, and I deserve that whop I got. Let's be real about things, folks. It won't do any good to blame God. It won't do any good to misassign blame, and that's what Micah says to the nation of Israel. Micah is kind of a straight shooter, if you will. He says, don't whine, don't cry, and he got that word from the Lord. Christian, I want to say to you, when we're wrong, the best thing we can do is just work on getting right and not spend our time wailing about our consequences. Don't cry about your consequences. You deserve them. Is there any nicer way of putting that? Well, let's see if I can find something nice to talk about here. Here we are in chapter 2. And we see not only did, well, first of all, not only did they prefer their idols, but in chapter 2 and verse 1, Micah goes on to say, woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it because it's in the power of their hands. So here, iniquity, of course, is wickedness. So here are people that are plotting and planning wickedness. In other words, they're planning to lie. They're planning to deceive. Matter of fact, 3 particular areas of wickedness are laid out in verse 2. The first one is the area of covetousness. In other words, here they are, they're planning their wickedness. The first thing is they covet fields and take them by violence. And so the accusation against Israel is you've done wrong and you've done violence, but your sin is covetousness and it's a planned sin. You lay in bed and think about wickedness. Now, what would be the problem for the nation of Israel with regard to coveting fields? Brother Bodie, I know you know the answer to that question, so I'll just put it to you so we can get an answer fast.
We saw with Ahab in our year that he wanted a field, and God said, you couldn't give up your field. That was not something you were to give away. That was to be yours from generation to generation.
It's an inheritance from the Lord.
Right.
Well, that is a correct answer. And he used the illustration of why it was that when Ahab wanted to buy the vineyard, that, what was his name?
Naboth.
Why Naboth couldn't sell his vineyard. Why can't I believe I can't remember that. Well, Naboth couldn't sell his vineyard. He said, Ahab, I'd be glad to sell you my vineyard except for one thing. God said don't. Now, that's a pretty big one thing. And Ahab went home and cried his eyes out. Just bawled his eyes out. He said, here I am, the king of Israel, and I can't even have a vineyard next to the palace so I can plant a garden for my herbs. And he told Naboth, he said, I'll pay you more than it's worth. I'll give you a better vineyard in exchange for it. Your vineyard's not that hot there, Naboth, but I'll give you a good one for it. Because I want to be able to have a vineyard close to the palace. And Naboth said, well, you're the king of Israel, and I like you and stuff, but God said don't sell your inheritance, so I can't.